Olivia looked perplexed. Cole laughed lightly. It's vain, I know, but I had somewhat hoped for more of a reaction from you. But then, I guess you had already deduced that much. Yes, we captured a Noctura, and we were transporting it to my lab in Sotsu. Obviously, it escaped confinement. Whether this was a lack of preparation on my part, or the fault of my subordinates, I suppose we may never know. As to the rest of the story, well, I'm sure you don't want to relive it. Now tell me truly, does that not satisfy your curiosity? Olivia opened and closed her mouth several times as if she would speak. Then, seemingly deciding better of it, she simply nodded. Really? Cole seemed almost disappointed. Well then, he took a last sip of wine and set the glass on the table and wiped his mouth daintily with his handkerchief. The truth is ever a burden, one which demands restraint. I trust you'll keep what you've seen a secret. Bad enough the Noctura have returned. We needn't be stoking anyone's fears, spreading wild stories, need we? Such carelessness might engender a panic, might undo all the good this nation has done. You understand, don't you? All the good this nation has done. Mitsue felt the bite of the words, but even so he nodded. He'd heard enough from Cole, and he thought now of only getting away. Olivia, though, hesitated. The conflict within her psyche was clear to read on her face, her curiosity warring against her better judgment. But then at last she too nodded. Very good. Cole stood. Now with that out of the way, I recommend you return to your seats and try to get some rest. We'll be arriving shortly. He walked to the door and slid it open and ushered them out into the hall. It was a pleasure meeting both of you. I'm certain we'll get to know each other much better during the semester. And I'll be sure to keep my eye on you. Two rising stars, as it were. He said this casually enough, but there was a stain of menace to his words. And here he looked deeply into Mitsue's eyes, his own full of sapphire flames, flickering behind his glasses. What we were talking about before. Hopefully I'll have ample opportunity to persuade you. It is possible, I think, to find beauty in all sorts of places, if one dares only to look. He smiled thinly, till then. And with that he closed the door. They stood a moment in the dim hall, dim after the brightness of the room. Then they turned, and together made their way back to their own cabin, the rain soaking them as they passed from car to car. The door was still open when they arrived, the oil lamp within burning gleefully once more. Mitsue took a seat to the right, Olivia to the left, and though they faced one another, for a time they didn't speak, the events of the night sluicing down the channels of their memory. In the silence Mitsue heard the voices once more, and lightly, as if blowing on the wind, his mother's song filling all the lonely air. And he listened, ears perked up like a wolf in the wastes of night. I'll never forget, Olivia began. Never. The faces. Her words deserted her. Briefly it looked as though her visage were being drawn down a cold, dark drain, all her features spiraling in, weighted by the horrors she'd witnessed, disgust and dread supple in her eyes. Mastering herself somewhat, she continued, I thought by going to Ignis I'd learn to fight them, but... She held her hands over her lap. Mitsue saw she was still shaking. Look at me. I've never been so afraid. With my waking eyes, I see it. I hear it. The voices inside my head. The things they said. She looked grimly at Mitsue. I thought I heard my grandfather whispering to me. Mitsue followed the trail of his mother's song as it faded into the hush of the early morning. What are they? Noctura, Olivia breathed, tears sparkling in her eyes like snowflakes in moonlight, falling from a silver-blushed sky. Mitsue had no words with which to answer. They let the quiet breathe, each pondering people in places far away. At last Olivia herniated the silence. And yet to hear him talk, she muttered, wiping her eyes. Beautiful, he called them, and the look on his face when he said it. She shook her head. Cole. She spat the name out as if it possessed a bitter taste. I don't for 1 minute believe those lies he was feeding us. As if chains could bind a Noctura, or a scalpel cut one. How could he possibly expect us to believe that? Mitsue pored over every detail of the freight train. In his memory the darkness rolled like waves beneath a ship, and the metal glittered like yellow eyes around a fire at night. What were they doing? The table, the chains, the IV, the doctors. How does it fit together? He glanced at Olivia. What do you think they were really doing back there? Olivia chewed her lip. I don't know. She stood and began to pace back and forth, speaking to herself softly under her breath. There was that red hair I found. Good men, Cole said of his assistants, but the hair was long. A woman's, maybe, but who? Another conspirator, or... She stopped dead in her tracks. No, he couldn't. He wouldn't. Would he? What? Mitsue asked, desperate to know what she had uncovered. She dropped onto the edge of her seat. What if Cole's conducting experiments? Human experiments. What? Think about it. It would explain everything. The hair, the IV, the chains. He had something chained up in there. Only it wasn't a nocturne as he claimed. It was a human. A woman, most likely with red hair. In his mind, Ray's hair fanned out along her back, moonlight setting fire to each crimson strand. No. He quashed the memory. He couldn't think of her now. What if Olivia's right? Honestly, what she'd said made sense, and after listening to Cole, hearing the yearning in his voice, there was little Mitsue couldn't imagine him capable of. But it still feels like we're missing something. He pressed his fingers against his lips, thinking. That still doesn't explain where the nocturne came from. No, Olivia said, and that's not the only question we still have to answer. Assuming I'm right, where did the test subject go? What ripped the door from the side of the train? And strangest of all, why did we hear words? She paused, chewing contemplatively at her fingernails. In Layton, when they came, I heard voices. I heard shouts and screams, crying, laughter, but nothing like tonight. Nothing intelligible, nothing human. She looked at Mitsue. I don't know what really happened, but I know Cole's hiding something big. One way or the other, I plan to find out what. Mitsue knuckled the cushion into shape and sat back. Secrets and lies. That was it. That was everything. Why was it so hard to find the truth? He ran back over their conversation, Cole's breath writhing on the air, and he tried not to hear the words, but to hear behind them, to what they concealed. Dreadful things, aren't they? Yet not without a certain grace. Beauty, one might say. What had he meant? Did he know something? Something about the nocturne's true nature? From the roiling dark his mother's form emerged, her tender hands outstretched. Mitsue. He stood and walked to the window and pulled the curtain back. It felt like his whole life was drawing together, all the discordant fibers angling in towards one center, but he couldn't see the connection. In his palm his stigmata lay flat, a red vortex for all his misery. Up beyond the window the moon was rising, the pitted silver face slipping over the horizon, coalescing their surroundings from the dark. They were speeding between short knotted mountains, the sides steep and dense and breathless with trees, the autumnal leaves white in the branches or littering the ground. Mitsue rested his head against the window. The glass felt cool. The night was colder than he remembered, the air heavy and wet. Not too far now. His breath clung to the pane, a misty specter growing and shrinking with each pull of his lungs. With his finger he drew a curved line, the contour of a face. He added pointed eyes, sweeping hair, chin, mouth, nose, the features rising out of the mist, rising out of his breath. When it began to look like Ray, he wiped it away with his hand. Mitsue, Olivia began hesitantly. He saw her watching him in the reflection on the glass. Why did he know your name?